Tov, Shavua Tov. We can still say Chodesh Tov. Today's daf is daf Ayin Hey and Sanhedrin. It's a good idea to have a chumash in front of you. Now, first we're going to go to the basic idea. Remember that we said about we've already discussed who gets skila. Now we're going to talk about in this parak who gets sreifa and who gets hereg. Now, who are the people who get sreifa? We've explained already. Sreifa is not burning at the stake, like people have done throughout the ages, and there were shilas about even in the Torah there were certain cases of burning at the stake. But the sreifa that we're talking about here is putting hot lead down the throat, forcing the mouth open. Be careful getting in there because I put the chumash. I'll take a chumash. Also, it's necessary to have a chumash for today's daf. The Eluhein and Nisrafim. So the following people are burned. Burned. Sreifa means that's a kind of death that they're killed by putting hot lead down their throats. Now, we've learned before that according to the predominant opinion, the order of Misos, Bezdin, in terms of strictness, is skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek, right? Skila is the highest, then sreifa, then hereg, and chenek. The other opinion of Shimon is no, that sreifa is the worst punishment. Sreifa, then skila, and instead of hereg and chenek, it's chenek and hereg. He switches around 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Okay, but these are the ones who get sreifa. Let's assume this is the second worst, second most stringent punishment. Who are they? Habal isha obita. If a man lives with his wife, now the simple translation is his wife and his daughter. Now, if you live with your wife, there's nothing wrong with that. You're supposed to, right? So what is al-bala isha obita? That's going to be a discussion in the Gemara. What do you mean isha obita? Okay, and ubas kohen shezinsa. If a bas kohen is married or betrothed, we've had that before, right? Bas kohen shezinsa, she also gets sreifa. Whereas normally a woman who is betrothed and commits adultery, her punishment is skila. And if she's fully married, the punishment is chenek. That's what the Torah says. But a bas kohen, if she's a bas kohen, she gets sreifa. So a bas kohen is in a category by herself. But what about this business about mother and daughter? Isho bita means, okay, you didn't say ishto, but it means mother and daughter. Now, what do we mean by that? We'll see. Now, yesh b'chlal isho bita, it's mashma from the Lashon and the Mishnah that in terms of isho bita, mother and daughter, what is included? Bita ubas mano. Now, these are people who get sreifa. Remember, if we had the first case of back on Nun Gimel, when we talked about the people who get skila, and we've been talking about that for several weeks now, the people who get skila, the first one, or what was it? The first, I think it's the first one or the second one. The first one is, the first one is your mother. If a person commits incest with his mother, punishment is skila. With his daughter, the punishment is sreifa. And that's what we're going to see here. There's 9 cases over here, besides Bas Kohen, a total of 10 in the Mishnah. But Bas Kohen shezinsa, she gets sreifa. Then we have 9 incestuous relationships where the punishment is sreifa. It's death, but it's sreifa by court. As opposed to, let's say, a sister. If a person committed incest with his sister, punishment's kares. You get malchus if there's Adam and Asraf and malchus, but there's no death by Bezdin. That's the law in the Torah. So he says over here, what's included? Yesh b'chal isha obita. And again, it's not clear. Isha obita, a mother and daughter. If the mother is your wife, there's nothing wrong with that. The daughters. So what's included? Bito, your daughter. If a person commits incest with his daughter, that's sreifa. Bas bito, his granddaughter. Bas mano, granddaughter from his daughter or from his son. Okay. Then that's if it's his relationship, meaning it's his daughter. Now, his daughter, his granddaughters can be with his wife, or it could be out of wedlock, right? A person can have a child out of wedlock. He's still the biological father, right? If a man has to be like people today don't get married, they just live together. Okay. Now it's not his wife, right? But it's his daughters. Okay. Then you can have bas ishto, his wife's daughter, even if it's not related, it's a stepdaughter. Man's wife's daughter, that's not your daughter. What is that? Your stepdaughter. Or bas bito, bas mana, or her granddaughters by her daughter or by her son. Okay, so now we've had how many? 6, because you have daughter, his own daughter, his 2 granddaughters. We'll call them his 2 granddaughters, bas bito, bas mano. Then we have his wife's daughter or his wife's granddaughters. That's a total of 6. Chamoso, his mother-in-law, the aim chamoso, the aim chamev. Oh, wow. his mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law's mother. What is that? His wife's grandmother, either from her mother, that would be Aim Chamoso, his wife's grandmother, his wife's mother's mother, or his wife's father's mother. Either Michael, take a chumash, please. Right here, take home. Right? Or Aim Chama. So we have a total of 9 incestuous relationships with the Mishnah says you get sreifa. Okay. So just understand very clearly, a man sleeps with his mother, punishment skila. Sleeps with his daughter, punishment sreifa. Both him and her if they did it willingly. Okay. Same thing with his mother. The mother, if he slept with his mother and they both did it willingly, punishment is skila. Okay. Supposed to, I'm just giving you a preamble to today's stuff because it's important to understand this. What if a man sleeps with his own grandmother? We just said that if a man sleeps with his daughters or granddaughters, or his wife's daughters or granddaughters, right? Punishment is sreifa. His mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law's mother or his father-in-law's mother, you gotta really be crazy here. Okay, we have to look, this is a Torah, you gotta understand all the cases, right? So in those cases, punishment sreifa. What about his own grandmother?
You don't I did, but you could learn it from a Kalva.
Okay. You don't base it on that. The answer is grandmother is not really Asr Min Torah. Because we're going to say why not, but it's different. Grandmother's not Asr Min Torah. It's one of the Shnias. It's in Yavamas we learned. It's one of the ones he shouldn't marry. But really, a grandmother is not Asr Min Torah. Kachazeh. Okay. Now let's understand the pasuk. But before we will see the psukim inside in a minute, we'll begin with Habal Isha. What does it mean? Mishnah says haba ala isha shenasa bita loktani. It doesn't say if a man al ishto shenasa bita that married his daughter. What does it mean about isha that shenasa bita? Meaning if a man was married to a girl and he slept with the mother with her mother, it doesn't say that. It says haba al isha ubita. If it would just say, who are we talking about? Of course you could live with your wife. So if he married a girl and then it says he slept with her mother, doesn't say that. It doesn't say haba al isha shenasa bita, lotan ela haba al isha ubita. Mechlal tabayis sur. Mashma they're both usher. Now what does that mean? Now I'm going to take a quick look. We're going to concentrate on 3 psukim today. Okay, we're first looking Vayikra Perek Chaf Pasuk Yudalet. Now remember in Perek Chaf it tells you the punishments. And in Perek Yud Ches, it tells you the prohibitions. Okay, so let's look at all of them right now. We're going to start though with the one in Chaf. Perek Chaf pasuk Yudal says, "Ish asher yikach es isha ves ima." If you take a girl, a woman, and her mother, zima, it's called zima. Licentiousness, whatever you want to call that. But eish yisrafu oso v'esen, burn them, oso him, the eshen and them. Okay, so what does that mean? If you live with a woman and her mother, what do you mean? If you're married to her, you could. It's not also to stay with her. It's also to marry her mother, right? You can't marry her mother. So what does it mean? Okay, so some learn. We're going to see on tomorrow's daf how to learn this. Do you say that oso means that really Isha is your wife and Ima is the mother that you're usher to? And what does it mean, oso? If you were going to get burned, the eshen means es achad mehen, one of them, meaning the mother-in-law. That's one way to learn. Or another way to learn is no. Isha and Ima is not your wife and her mother. It's 2 women that you can't sleep with. Who would it be the 2 women you can't sleep with? Your mother-in-law and her mother. Your mother-in-law's usher and her mother. Okay? So again, Isha shikachas Isha ves Ima. Obviously, your wife you can stay with. If a man is married to a woman and chas v'chalila he commits adultery with her mother, he's not usher to his wife. His wife is still his wife, right? His wife is still his wife. She commits adultery, that's a different story, right? She's a sot and all that. But if he commits adultery with her mother or with anybody, he's not usher to her. So what is in Beishis? But the punishment is streifa. So that's what that pasuk tells us. Okay, that's talking about a woman and her mother. Who is the woman and her mother? Some say that the woman is your wife, and only her mother is the one who gets streifa. You and her mother get streifa. Obviously, you can't stay with your wife too long afterwards because you're going to be killed by streifa. But it doesn't mean that. But the act itself does not prohibit you to your wife. Okay, except that you're being chayiv misa, edom and asra, etc. Okay, so that's what that pasuk is. So what does that mean? As isha v'es ima. Does it mean your wife and her mother, in which case only her mother would be the bad one? Your wife hasn't done anything wrong. Or does Isha Vesima mean no? Isha Vesima means they're both usher. So back in the Gemara now, Abal Isha Shanasabita Loktani, Abal Isha Bita Machal Tarvayil Isur, they're both usher. So what does it mean, Isha, if you live with a woman and her mother, and they're both usher to you, and all the other ones that the Gemara goes on is going to say, yeah, the Mishnah said, Yesh Bechlal Isha Bita, all these other 9 things included in Isha Bita, which are beferish in the Torah L'chora, we include these other ones. But we'll see, some of the 9 are included there, like mother-in-law and mother-in-law. We'll talk about that. That's where I was going to get Mechal Tavai Lisura, Umanin, who was at Chamosa Bein Chamoso. So the Gemara at this point assumes, like we'll see this one shita, that Chamoso, when the pasuk is, if you take a woman and her mother, we're talking about the woman is your mother-in-law and her mother, Aim Chamoso, and then who's going to be burned? You and both of them. Right? You're married to the daughter, and you married her mother and her grandmother. You married her mother, right, and her grandmother. So you and the mother-in-law and the grandmother are all going to be burned. Viktani, back in the Gemara, Viktani yesh bechlal isha obita, and it says what's included in isha obita? Bechlal tavai ksiva b'heges, mashma that they're both written beferish. In other words, when the pasuk says isha vesima, we mean chamoso ve'im chamoso, and the other things on hanach madrashasi. The other ones are learned out from there. So according to Abaya, who says what, that we're going to see this on tomorrow's daf, that how do you learn the words in the pasuk mashmos or shanik binayu masis and money Rabbi Kiva? So he'll say the Mishnah is going to go like Rabbi Kiva. It's all going to be explained on tomorrow's Gemara. We don't see it right now, but the Gemara's Gemara is going to explain that tomorrow in the pasuk. So in other words, he says Isha vesima. When the pasuk says Isha vesima, we mean your mother-in-law and her mother. Okay, that's what we mean. And then the other ones are learned out. All these other ones are learned out. How are they learned out? We'll see. When we say the other ones, we're talking about daughter and granddaughters and your wife's daughter and granddaughter that we said all those people are burnt. They're learned out from here. We'll see how that's learned out. Money goes like Rabbi Kiva on tomorrow's daf. El Rava, the Omar Chamoso, he says no. Rava says that Isha means your wife. That's Ima. Why is it? So we're talking about the chiddush is that your mother-in-law you can't live with even after your wife dies. Even if your wife dies, remember, if your wife dies, chas v'chalila, you can marry her sister, right? But you can't marry her mother. That's what it's talking about. Right? So Masli money, who does our Mishnah go like? Who does our Mishnah go like? What does it mean, Isha Bita? Isha Bita does not mean your mother-in-law and her mother, right? It doesn't mean that. So what's pshat in the Mishnah? Amal Charava, Tani Habal Isha Shanasabita. And he changes the words of the Mishnah. If you live with a woman, meaning who is the Isha? Because you married her daughter, and now you live with that woman. We're only talking about Chamos, we're only talking about your mother-in-law. You understand? So that pasuk of Isha Vesbita, according to one opinion, Isha is your mother-in-law and Ima is her mother, your mother-in-law's mother. According to another opinion, no, Isha is your wife and Ima is Chamoso, and that's what the Mishnah means. When the Mishnah says Abal Isha Bita, it doesn't mean both of them are also like mother-in-law and her mother, but rather you live with a woman who is the mother of your wife. Okay, 2 ways to understand the Mishnah. Mishnah goes on, Yesh B'chal Isha Bita. What's included in Isha Bita? Chamoso, ve'im chamav. It's included in that. Now, how is that included? Aim chamav, the mother of your father-in-law, is not Isha Bita. So how is it included? Okay, so now we're going to. That's what the Mishnah says. Yesh B'chal Isha Bita, chamoso ve'im chamav. L'Abaye. Now, what do you mean? According to Abaye, who just said what? That chamoso and aim chamoso are favorish in the pasuk. So what do you have not learned about drasha l'baya? I did the kabbalah misnei aim chamav. Since what's the drasha? Again, according to Abaye, when it says isha shikach isha besima, excuse me, means literally your mother-in-law and her mother. So that's a befavorish in the pasuk. So what's the drasha yesh b'chlal included in the isha bita? We're including this. What do you have to include it? It's already listed. It's befavorish in the Mishnah, in the Torah rather. Labai, I did Kabbalah Mishnah. You want to teach me Aim Chamav, so Tani Nami Chamosa, Aim Chamosa. Right. The Chiddush is only your father-in-law's mother, because your mother-in-law and her mother are already included. When the Mishnah says, when the Torah says as Isha as Ima, we mean already your mother-in-law and your mother-in-law's mother. So what do you mean? Included in mother and daughter is Chamosa and Aim Chamosa. Aim Chamosa was already listed in the pasuk. Oh, so he's just telling you, since you want to tell me Aim Chamav, since you want to say Aim Chamiv, your father-in-law's mother, Taninami Chamosa, we already mentioned Chamosa and Chamosa, even though those are favorites in the pasuk. L'Rava, according to Rava, that Isha means your wife in the pasuk, and Ima means mother-in-law. So if I did to combine the Aim Cham Veim Cham, since you want to learn out of a drasha, your father-in-law's mother and your mother-in-law's mother, Taninami Chamosa, as you mentioned Chamosa, even though even Chamosa is favorites in the pasuk, everybody agrees that Chamosa is in the pasuk. The question is the Isha Chamosa or is the Ima Chamosa, right? Where do we get this all from? Now, keep your finger in this place in Perek Chav Pasuk Yudalid and go back to Perek Yud Ches, where we're going to talk about your on the lower generation, not mother and mother-in-law, not mother-in-law, not mother. Mother is excluded. We're not talking here about your mother. We're talking about your mother-in-law and her mother, or your father-in-law's mother. Father-in-law's mother. Now we're going to talk about the Isur in Perek Yud Ches. Let's first look at Pasuk Yud, which talks about the prohibition of marrying your daughters and daughters-in-law, daughters and granddaughters. It says Ervas Bas Bimcha or Bas Bitcha, the nakedness, meaning that you're not allowed to sleep with your granddaughter, whether it be Bas Bimcha or Bas Bitcha, your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. In this pasuk, it doesn't say Zima. Notice, I'm looking at pasuk Yud in Perek Yud Ches. It doesn't say Zima. It says Heina. Right? Okay. It says don't sleep. How do we know your own daughter? How do we know that it doesn't sleep with us? So we learned that's learned out of psukim, the Gzeira Shava, not of a Kal V'chomer, because like you say, Ein Onshim and Adin. It's learned out of psukim that since we're going to see the next pasuk. Now look at pasuk Yud Zayin. A few psukim later in Perek Yud Ches, it says Ervas Isha Ubita Lo Skale. Now, when it says Ervas Bas Bimcha Bas Bitcha, that could be your own daughter, even though she's not your wife's daughter. Maybe you had her out of out of wedlock. In other words, she could be in what we call an illegitimate child, although it doesn't mean a mamzer. It just means that your daughter out of wedlock. It means your physical daughter. In Pasuk Yud Zayin, we're talking about your wife's daughter. Could be your daughter too, but it could be your stepdaughter. Ervas Isha Ubita Lo Skale, right? You're not allowed to look at that be with a woman and her daughter, meaning if your wife, you can't have her daughter. Es Baspanov Es Besbita, meaning you can't have both. You can have Bia with a woman, but you can't have Bia with her daughter. If you can't have woman, if she's your wife, if your wife's daughter, Lo Skale, Spaspanos Bita, not her granddaughters, Lo Sika Shara Hena Zimahi. Here it says both the word Hena and Zima. Now that's going to be important. So here it's clear that you can't. There's a prohibition to sleep with your daughter, your granddaughters, whether they're your granddaughters or your wife's daughters or granddaughters. Notice by wife it says daughter. So we're going to learn out by your own children. It's also daughter. That means any child. You can't sleep with your wife's daughter. You can't sleep with your daughter, your wife's daughter. You can't sleep with your granddaughters. You can't sleep with her granddaughters. But by her granddaughters it says Shara Hena Zimahi. By your granddaughters it only says Hena. Okay. What is the punishment for these things? Our Mishnah just said Sreifa. On any of these things, your daughter, her daughter. Your daughter, her. If it's your daughter and her daughter, of course, it's your daughter and her daughter. Your daughter, her daughter. Your granddaughters, her granddaughters. The punish, right? That's all usher. What's the punishment? Sreifa. How do you know? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that in Perek Chav when it talks about the punishment. It only talks about mothers and your mother-in-law, right? And her mother talks about their Baishis Rofu. So it's going to learn out from Zima. That's what we're going to discuss right now. Back in the Gemara. How do we know this? Now you know that pasuk, right? In my Gemara, it says Vayikra Chaf Daled, right? Is that what it says in your Gemara? Where does it? But it's really it's not. That's not the pasuk. The pasuk is in Vayikra Chaf that I just quoted. That's a mistake there. The Chaf Daled. Okay. So Isha Shikach es Isha ves Ima. Okay, now we're talking about a mother, a woman and her mother, and we said that could be, it could be your wife's mother, or it could be your mother-in-law and her mother, according to Iyabaya Rabbah. Okay, Bas Isho, Bas Bito, Bas Benam. And where do we know this from? How about the daughter of your wife or her granddaughters? How do you know she gets Sreifa too? Nemerkan Zima. It says Zima. Which Zima we talked about? Nemer Zima. It says here Zima in the pasuk, what in Perek Chav pasuk Yedalu when it talks about your punishment for your mother-in-law. Let's say your mother-in-law, she's definitely going to get sreifa. We're talking about mother-in-law, right? That's the favorite. We're talking about that the ishaves ima. Ima is definitely either the mother-in-law or the mother-in-law's mother. There it says zima, and it says zima here in Perek Yud Ches pasuk Yud Zayin. Okay, v'namon zima malon bita ubas bita ubas bana. Just like over there, the whole it means granddaughter, daughters and granddaughters. Afkan bita bita bas bas bana. Here also gets straight. In other words, how do we know that sleeping with, let's say, the lower generations, let's call it, the lower generations get sreifa? Learn it from the upper generations. I'm calling the upper generations mother-in-law and above that, and her mother, and the lower generations daughters and granddaughters. Okay. How do we know to make males like females? What do we mean by that? Males like females can't sleep with males. Males is homosexual, right? You can't do that. So we don't know what that means at this Gemara is going to discuss that. Again, Nemer kan zima, but I'm on zima, malon sachar mekevus, afkan sachar mekevus. Okay, because the zima connects to two areas. Notice we're talking about though your wife's daughters and granddaughters, right? That's where it says zima. The first pasuk in Perek Yud Ches that we refer to, pasuk Yud, that talks about your granddaughters, and we're going to see also by we're going to learn about drasha that your daughter also. What does it say? How do we know? There it doesn't say zima. We'll see. How do we know to make the ones below as the ones above? What do you mean by below and above? Presumably lower generations like upper generations. We don't know yet what it means. The Gemara is going to talk about that. Again, says zima both in Perek Yud Ches pasuk Yud Zayin and in Perek Chav pasuk Yud Dalet. Mala and lamatika lamala, just like where there we said lamata is like lamala, afkan lamatika lamala, but we don't. It's not clear yet what that means. Umakan lamala kalamata aflaholan lamala kalamata. Just like there we said the lower ones like the upper ones. Here also the upper ones like the ones, but we don't know yet what that means. The Gemara is going to explain this. Now we're going to analyze these last two phrases. How do we know males like females? What do you mean by that? Ilema basbina kamasbita. Maybe it means this, that the granddaughter of your son, via your son's daughter should be like your daughter's daughter. Maybe you want to learn from that. What are you talking about? They're both said together. Zaspina, that's basbita. It's not like how do we know your son's daughter should be usher to you like your daughter's daughter? You're going to learn out of a drasha? No, it says beferish, but they both learn out of the same pasuk. And even if you're talking about your own, basbincha, basbitcha also says that your own, not even not your own. Ella, aim chamav ke aim chamosa. How do we know that your father-in-law's mother is usher to you like your mother-in-law's mother? So wait a minute. At this point, we're assuming not that the drasha we already explained that Isha, when that pasuk in Perek Chav, when it says Isha Vesima, we understand it already to mean chamosa and chamosa. We don't know that yet. We're going with the pashup shot that Isha means Isha Sheikachas Isha Vesima. We mean your wife. So how do we know? And we don't even know yet. Your wife and what? And her mother. That's your mother-in-law. We haven't yet learned that. Rashi in the 2 lines from the bottom of the page said, 3 lines bottom of the page. 4 lines take it. We haven't learned out yet that your mother-in-law's mother is usher. So how do you know your father-in-law's mother? In other words, all we can see out of the pasuk, the pasuk shot in the pasuk is if you take your wife and her mother. Okay, that's your mother-in-law. How do you know your mother-in-law's mother? We don't know that yet. So what are you saying? Scharm should be in the case. How do we know that your father-in-law's mother should be also too like your mother-in-law's mother? We don't know yet about mother-in-law's mother. How can you learn one from that if you haven't learned the first one? We haven't yet figured out mother-in-law's mother, Aim Chama Mahadale, you're trying to figure out Aim Chama from there, your father-in-law's mother from your mother-in-law's mother. We don't know yet your mother-in-law's mother's us. We haven't learned that out yet. Amar Abaya, and Amar Beis Hachikamer. Menayin laso share haba mimenu k'share haba mimena. Oh, how do we know? This is what it means, Charm Kenekave. It's not talking about sons, daughters, or father-in-law's mother. I mean this. How do we know that the relations via yourself are also like the relations via your wife? Minayin laso share haba mimenu, right? Your own issue should be also just like share haba mimena. How do we know that? It says nemer kan zima v'nemel holan zima. It says both. Meaning, how do we know? Rashi says, Amr Baya, top line. Haischam mekevis la alav Alav al ishto kamer, talking about him and his wife. Hochi kamer, menayin lasu share abami menu, dainu bito bas beno, ubas bito, menusoso, the labmachal isha bita, the quadenu. How do we know the same? In other words, Pasuk Yud in Parak Yud Ches was talking about, we said, your daughters, your granddaughters, not necessarily your wives. Your wife could be one woman, and maybe you had daughters and granddaughters from another woman, not your wife. How do we know that's also to you? It says lo scholar of us. Okay, that's the pasuk for telling me that it's usher. How do we know they get streifa? What did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said there are nine besides the Bas Kohen, there are 9 cases of family incest that you get streifa for. And we said bito, bas beno. How do we? Okay, we know it's usher. We know that it's usher at the pasuk Parak Yud Ches is iser prohibition. Erebus bas bencho bas lo scholar. How do you know it gets streifa? So it says, okay, how do we know that? Remember, we already explained, we sort of explained already, right? That how do you know, we didn't just sort of, we explained it. How do we know that your wife's daughters and granddaughters get streifa? It says zima by your mother and by the mothers-in-law, by the upper generations, and it says zima over here. Okay, fine. It doesn't say zima by your own granddaughters, right? By your granddaughters out of wedlock. Back in the Gemara. Wait a minute, it doesn't say zima. In Parak Yud, I pointed out before, it doesn't say zima. No, it says hena, right? It doesn't say zima. Babasher didei loksiv zima. Amali Rav Yitzchak Baravim explained like this: Asi hena, asi zima zima. First, we get a relationship between hena in Pasuk Yud and Parak Yud Ches, and between hena in Pasuk Yud Zayin. In Parak Yud Ches, where it talks about your wife's daughters and granddaughters. So first you learn out Hena from Hena, and then you say Zima Zima. So it's like a double Gzera Shava. And we're not talking about Kachim over here that you can't learn out one, you can't learn a double. A to B and B to C, you could do over here. So first it's Hena, so that your own granddaughters are like your wife's granddaughters. And then by your wife's granddaughters, it says Zima. So just like by your wife's granddaughter, it says Zima, which is Sreifa, learning out from Parak Chav. Same thing over here. Amar Mak. How do you know below should be like above? What do you mean by lamata kilamala? Ilema basbena ubasbita kibita. Are you telling me? Oh, maybe your how do you know that your granddaughters have the same malach as your daughter? Just like your daughter gets sreifa. If you have a deal with your daughter, you get sreifa. Basbena and basbita also could be that way. How do you know? How do you know? What are you talking about? I don't need a drush. It's the same thing. It says Ervas Isha Ubita Los Scalias Basmanos Vita. The same way you know that you can't have beer with your daughter and the punishment would be sreifa based on zima. The same thing as the granddaughters. It says beferish badi dadikas ella aim chama veim chamoso kachamoso. Oh, maybe it means this. How do you know that your wife's, let's call it your wife's 2 grandmothers should be usher like your wife's mother, right? Like your wife's mother, your mother-in-law. How do you know that your wife's grandmother should be usher to you like your grandmother? So that's high lamata kalamala. That's not the lower one like the upper one. The upper one would be the grandmother in terms of generations. It's 2 generations above. Lamala kalamata havai. That's how do you know that the upper generations, your wife's grandmother should be usher to you with the punishment of streifa, just like your wife's mother. So Tani Lamala Kalamata. So the first part is okay. So learn Tani Lamala Kalamata. How do you know that the upper generations is like the lower generations? So how do you know that the wife's grandmother should be also like your wife's mother? Ihachi Nemerkan Ziva Nemelhon Zima. So you say what? Based on Zima and Zima. My hashta ini lo ksiva Zima to ksiva. What are you talking about? It doesn't say mother. It doesn't say beferish, right? It doesn't say, it doesn't even say, how do you know that the streifa should be just like what? Just like your wife's should be, your wife's mother should be also b'streifa here also, but it doesn't say it b'ferish. Tani lamalika lamata. Siyoki nemer kan zima demon zima. My hashta inu lo ksiva zima de ksiva. And Rashi says over here. Rashi says here. It says here. Sharahina zimahi. Right, meaning zimahi. So Rashi here is going on. Azim ksiva. I'm going. Rashi is right before the lines get wide. Hashin lo ksiva. Aim cham veim chamos las haraso lo nshan lo ksiva. It doesn't say the grandmothers. Zimru ksiva bitmia. The Komer Nemer Kan Zima, it says Zima. What do you mean? It doesn't say Zima by mother-in-law's mother at all. In other words, we're trying to say, how do you know that your wife's your wife's grandmother should be usher to you because it says Zima there, and it says Zima by your wife's mother. That's chamosa. Everybody agrees that Perek Chof, Pasuk Yadalit, Isha Shikachas Isha Vesima, in that Pasuk is chamosa, one way or another, your mother-in-law. Either Isha's is a chamoso, or Ima, her mother, is chamoso. But that's chamoso. But where does it say chamoso? It says, how do you know that your wife's grandmother should be also too like your wife's mother? Oh, it says Zima here, it says Zima there. It doesn't say Zima by Aim Chamoso, by your wife's grandmother. It doesn't talk about that at all. Back in the Gemara, right where the lines get wide. Yochi Nemerkan Zima of an Emelhon Zima. What do you mean? What is it? It says Zima here. It says the Gemara and Ahmed Aleph said, the Bai said, how do we know Lamatos Kalamala Zima here? What do you mean? Mashta Inilok Ziba. They're not. It doesn't say Zima by either one. It doesn't even say, the pasuk doesn't say beferish mother-in-law's mother. It doesn't say that beferish. So Zima, how could it say it says Zima? It doesn't say that. Amar bai hachikamer. Minayin lasos, here's the drasha. What's lamata kalamala? Means this. It doesn't mean that your mother's that lamala kalamata, that the grandmother should be like the mother. Means this. Minayin lasos shlosha doris lamala k'shlosha lamana. How do we know that we go 3 generations up? In other words, including your mother, including your wife, and her mother and her grandmother. That's 3 generations, right? And generations down means your wife and her daughter and her granddaughter. So that's the 3 generations. How do we know that we make 3 generations above? That would include your wife's grandmothers, like your wife's granddaughters. How do we know? Nemer lamata zima. Oh, it says lamata going down 3 generations. It says zima. That's pasuk Yud Zayin and pasuk in Perek Yud Ches. Nemer lamala zima, and it says zima lamala when it talks about generations above, like mother-in-law. Malamata, it's 3 generations. Aflamala, 3 generations, it's 3 generations. Uma ba'onesh, and just when it comes like the punishment, asa lamata kilamala. Makes no difference, right? If it's the onesh is sreifa kilamala, apas haranami asalamala kilamata. In other words, the ashara. Where does it say the mother-in-law and the mother-in-law's mother a prohibition? The punishment, it says isha ima. There it talks about mother-in-law getting burnt, right? They get burnt. Where's the prohibition? The answer is the prohibition is learned out, just like the mata, the 3 generations below in Perek Yud Ches Pasuk Yud Zayin, 3 generations below, there's a prohibition there. So the same thing Abazara Sasalamala Kilamata, make the Asara there too. That's how we learn. So this way to learn is that Lamata Kilamala means what? 3 generations 3 generations above. Lamala Kilamata, 3 generations above is like 3 generations below. It talks about 3 generations below when it talks about mother, when it talks about wife, daughter and granddaughter. That's 3 generations below, going down. So therefore, we apply the prohibition also to 3 generations above, not only for the prohibition, but also for the ownership. How do we know that it means how do we know your mother-in-law's mother is also? How do we know your father-in-law's mother is also? It doesn't say father-in-law's mother, mother-in-law's mother. The answer is we learn from 3 generations. That's one way to learn. Rav Ashi says no. Lolam kerekani. Leave it the way we said originally. What would we say originally? In the Lamata Kalamala was not that because the way we're running it now is how do we know that the generations above are like the generations below? 3, just like 3 below, it says beferish in the pasuk, so 3 above also. But in the original Gemara, the Gemara had said, Minayin lasos lamata kilamala. How do we know to make the ones below like the ones above? Now he switched it around to me. No. How do we make rains above 3 generations above like the 3 generations below? Rashi says no. Rashi says leave it the way it was. Loam kerektani. That what? How do you know to make the 3 generations below like the 3 generations above? But it doesn't like generations. My lamata be'isr means this. What do you think is the worst isser? What would your logic say? A mother-in-law or a mother-in-law's mother? Well, look at your own mother. Your mother is Asr B'skila. Your grandmother's not Asr at all in Torah. You would think that the further the generation is away, the less of a prohibition it is. That's what he means by lamata ulamala. Lamata means it's not as bad of an isser. Lamata be'isser. Right? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi about 10, 12 lines down in the wide lines in Rashi. Rashi, Ravashi Omer Laola, Ravashi in Rashi, Ravashi, Lolam Kidiktoni. Delot Tzarch Lapuyam to Lemesne Malaholan, Malahalan, Lamata, Kilamala, Afkan Lamala, Kilamata, right? You want to say Lamala is like Lamata? No. Ela Afkan Lamata, Kilamala, Umay Lamata, they come out Lamata be Isser. Isser Hakal, the easier, the less stringent Isser would be Kali Lamata. The Hachomer, the more stringent one, is Kari Lamala. How do you know to make your wife's grandparents, your wife's grandmothers that are Shem B'chokin and they're less of an Isra? So Lamata Kechamos, that's what he means. And how do you know to make your wife's grandparents, grandmothers, also like your wife's mother, right? In other words, so how do you know the ones to make a less of an Isra? Grandmothers are not as bad as a mother, right? Grandmothers are not as how do you know to do that? She Krover, your mother-in-law is closer to you in generation. We saw El Young, the Chomer, so Nemakan Ziva, that's what. So that's what. That's how he understands it. Lamata Kalamala. How do you know to make the lesser generations? How do you know? Because you learn out Zima Vizima, just like by your wife's daughter and granddaughters. The granddaughters are further away, would be less of an Isser as daughters, but just like over there, it's less of an Isser here too, less of an Isser. So that's why you say, how do we know to make Lamata Kalamala, the ones that have a less an Isser, like the higher Isser, just like we find in Pesach Yud Zayin, in Perak Yud Ches, where it says Zimahi, and it says that the granddaughter is as Asr as your daughter, the same way your mother-in-law's mother is as Asr as your mother-in-law. That's where Rav Ashi learns it. Now the Gemara says, Imahi aim ima asura, afu aim ima asura. Now we're going to get into if you're trying to say that, okay, we're comparing your Isser. We said the Iyaki is going on. Remember at the top of the page, we said that Isurim of your wife is as Asr as your own Isurim, right? We said, right? As we said, how do you know that if you sleep with your own daughter or granddaughter, the punishment is Sreifa? If it's not your wife's, your wife, it says Zima, and the Pasuk in Parakuf, it says Zima. So we compared Heina, and then Zima. So we learned out that your own children that are not your wife's children are as also to you as your wife's children. Okay, but if you're saying Master Sheva, so why don't you say also, listen, okay, if your wife's children are also, if your own children are also to you as your wife's children, maybe your own mother going up should be also to you. Maybe your grandmother should be as also to you as her grandmother. We just said that your wife's grandmother is also to you a punishment of Sreifa, right? And what is the punishment for your own grandmother? Nothing. Nothing. Technically, it's not also in Torah. But your wife's grandmother, that's Sreifa. And your grandmother, nothing? What is going on? That's what the Gemara is asking now. Ihachi, back in the Gemara. It says Ihachi. Imahi, just if you say, listen, by your wife, you're comparing your wife to your to your relations. Imahi, aim ima asura, her grandmother's usher to you. Afu aimimo, so maybe your own grandmother should also was you. Amrabaya, Amrakor, you're right, it could be that way. Amrakor, the pasuk says, imchahi, your mother, mishum imo, atamachayvi tamachayvo, mishum aimimo. When it talks about not living with your mother, right? It says that you can't live with your mother, that it's usher to sleep with your mother. It says imchahi, right? One of the pasuk there, right? It says imchahi, she is your mother. Imchahi lo sigalei v'sa. Don't live with her, right? Right? You can't sleep with your mother. Okay, so imchahi means only your mother. Only imchahi, she's your mother. Imchahi mishum imcha. Again, let me see. Amar by Amar Kwa Imchahi Mishum Aim Imo Mishum Imo Ata Machayv. You Machayv for his mother, only for the mother. You have to Machayv Mishum Aim Imo. Okay, a special pasuk saying you don't have it. Rava says no. It doesn't make sense to learn out one from another. Why? Whether you learn out all these drushes are based on Gzeira Shava, Heina Zima. Whether you learn out by Gzeira Shava, there's two ways to learn Gzeira Shava. One is Gzeira Shava is Menat Torah, as we said, is that's the Kabbalah we have. It's like it says Beferish, but what does it say Beferish? That's not clear. You learn out one from there. You learn out A from B, but how much? One says Don Mina. Famous Machlokas. Do you learn out everything? Don Mina Umina. Everything you learn out from A to B. Oh, you learn out some things from A from B, but not everything. You put it in its own spot. Still, you can't lose. You can't, you won't be able to learn out. In other words, not based on the, how do you know you can't sleep with your own grandmother? Not because of imchi. The first Abai says imchi, only your mother, not your mother. Okay, that's simple. Pasuk. He says it doesn't work out. Why? If you're learning out A from B totally, mahi, I'll say, listen, you want to learn out that just like your wife's grandmother, you can't sleep with your own grandmother. Mahi, Amy Masura, Afhunami, Amy Masura. Right? That's what we want to learn out. Just like your wife's grandmother is also, your own grandmother should also be also. Mina, Mahi Besreifa. What are you going to say? Okay. Oh, if you're learning out from your wife's grandmother, but if your wife's grandmother, the punishment is what? Sreifa, like we said in the mission, like we've been learning all along. Afhunami, here's also the punishment should be Sreifa. Should you say then, what do you want to learn out? Your grandmother is also to you as your wife's grandmother. Okay, and what's your punishment for your wife's grandmother? Sreifa. So you want to say the punishment for your grandmother should also be Sreifa. Lemandam or Sreifa chamor. If you go like Rav Shimon, Sreifa is more chamor. Does that make sense? What do you say? Malahi shekain ima b'Sreifa. Your wife's grandmother, your mother's b'Sreifa, so her grandmother's b'Sreifa. Tamar bahu shima b'skila. But your own mother is skila. This makes sense to say that the punishment for your mother is skila. That's what favors in the Torah, right? The Me'ah above, right? The punishment is skila. And the punishment for your grandmother should be worse, Sreifa. Does that make sense? Your grandmother's further away. Ima b'skila, ema b'sreifa. Does it make sense at all? So first one you want to say, oh, just like sreifa, and you're going to say that the mother should get skila, right? Tamar bahu shima b'skila. In other words, it's not comparable because in your case of your wife, you would say the grandmother's b'sreifa. That's because the mother's b'sreifa. But in your case, your mother's b'skila. Right, your mother's b'skila, so therefore it doesn't make sense to say that your grandmother should be b'sreifa. And can it make sense that the punishment for your own mother is a lesser punishment than for her mother, than for sleeping with your grandmother, her mother?
On whether you hold which is worse.
That's if you hold straight. We'll get to the other one in a second. Okay, so we have two kashas so far. Number one, you want to learn out from your wife, but your wife's mother and her mother both get sreifa. But over here, by your mother, she gets skila and her mother gets sreifa. They're not the same, apples and oranges. And also, does it make sense to say that your mother should be a lesser punishment than your grandmother? And the third question, mahi, just like by her lo chalakta bein ima emima, just like by her, there's no difference between mother and mother-in-law, meaning between mother and grandmother, right? Your wife's mother, your mother-in-law, your wife's mother and her mother, there's no difference. They're both sreifa. Also, there should be no difference between mother and mother-in-law, so therefore you can't learn it out. And this kasha, Michael, your question, and even if you hold skila is more chamor, the last kasha is still good. Even you can't ask, well, your mother's beskila and your grandmother's besreifa. That would make sense. She's further away. She should get a lesser punishment. But the last kasha still makes sense. Just like by your mother, if you're learning out your grandmother, your grandmother from her grandmother, but by her grandmother, there's no difference between mother and her mother. And here you're making a difference between mother and her mother because you're saying your mother's beskila and her mother's besreifa, and her mother, your mother's mother is besreifa. They're not the same, even though it makes sense to say yes, it should be less of a punishment, but you can't learn it out from your wife's mother and grandmother, because there they get the same punishment. Here they don't get the same punishment. So therefore, back to our issue, how do you know? Maybe just like if you're learning out your relations from her relations, you want to say, just like with her relations, her grandmother is also to you, therefore your grandmother should also be also to you. It's different because by her grandmother is the same punishment as her mother. By you, it wouldn't be the same punishment if you're learning out sreifa from your wife's mother. And even if you want to say that you don't learn it out totally, just learn out that the grandmother is usher, but not necessarily the same punishment. Mahi, you still could say there's a difference. Mahi emi basura, afunami emi masura. That's what you want to say, right? It's just like your wife's grandmother's usher to you, so should your own grandmother be usher to you. Vokibasra, and put it in its place. Hasam, okay, there it's besreifa because your wife's family is besreifa, right? Avalacha beskila kedash mima. Maybe here it should be beskila. In other words, learn out that your grandmother should be usher to as your wife, except not everything the same. There, her grandmother gets sreifa, the mother gets sreifa. Here, since your mother gets your punishment for your mother's skila, it should be a skila. The mandom is sreifa chamura. If you say sreifa is more chamur equal and mefrach, you could say, well, it's different over there by the mother. She can't even be sreifa. You can't learn out what your mother, your grandmother from her grandmother. Why? because that's more chomer. She gets sreifa. So you're since they get sreifa, her mother gets sreifa, and the grandmother gets sreifa. But over here, she can't even, her mother's basreifa. Your mother's only baskila, so it's less of a punishment. Tomer bahushima baskila, so it's not as stringent, so you can't learn it out. In other words, that's more chomer over there. Since her mother is basreifa, so you could say that her grandmother's also usher to you. But in your case, where your mother's only getting skila, according to the shita, that sreifa is more chomer, they're only getting skila, so you can't learn out the grandmother at all. Vod, who he should be like her. Mahi lo chalakta bein. Just like by her, there's no difference between bita lo aim ima, no difference between the daughter and the grandmother and aim ima and her grandmother, meaning they all get sreifa, right? Bein bita lo aim ima. Afhu also lo tachluk bo bein bito lo aim ima. Here also, there should be no difference between bito and his grandmother and la'aim ima and his grandmother. You're not going to make a difference. And what are you going to say? Get skila? In other words, you say, according to this shita, yes, you learn out the isers both. Your grandmother's also like her grandmother, but your grandmother gets skila, right? Because you put it in its place just like your mother and her. But over here, we have two differences. Number one, if you hold sreifa is more chomer, so she's more chomer because she gets sreifa. Her mother gets sreifa. Your mother only gets skila, so you can't learn one from the other. And another difference, look at her. He should be just like her. You're learning out his wife's, the husband's relationship, meaning his mother, his grandmother, from the wife's relationship. But by the wife's relationship, if you sleep with her daughter and you sleep with her grandmother, they're both sreifa, right? Her grandmother's up. Well, afulo tachlik bein bito le'emimo, and then, but also you should make a difference then between his daughter and his grandmother. But his daughter is basreifa, that's clear, right? The daughter is basreifa, and emo is baskila, because we're saying uki basra, just like his mother's baskila, his grandmother should be baskila. So they're not the same apples and oranges. Ulamando baskila is chamura. If you hold that skila is more chamer, so you can't ask the first kasha and say, well, ma'alihisha kain ima basreifa, tomar bu baskila. Skila is more chamer, right? Skila is more chamer. So if you say skila is more chamer, baskila chamura, you can't learn out this last kasha is a good kasha. In other words, when you want to say that sreifa is more chamer, so you say, oh, you can't learn out from Isha because she gets sreifa and you only get skila. But if you say skila is more chomer, so that's not a kasha, that's more chomer. This should be more chomer. But the second kasha is a good kasha. Say it's not the same. Why? Because by the wife, whether it's her daughter or her grandmother, punishment sreifa. By your daughter, it's not, your daughter is not the same punishment as your grandmother, because your daughter, clearly the pasuk says sreifa based on heina and zimahi, and your grandmother, we just said, should be baskila, not the same, so you can't learn one from the other. Okay, then the Gemara is going to go on. What about daughter-in-law? Imahu, well, just like his daughter-in-law is usher to him, your daughter-in-law is usher even after your son dies. You can't marry your daughter-in-law. What about her daughter-in-law? Her daughter-in-law, not usher. Maybe you should learn out that way too. The Gemara is going to go on these discussions tomorrow about learning them all out. But it's clear, at least you have clear in your mind that what the punishments are and what the isurim are. What the isurim are. We'll pick it up here tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem. Have a good day, everybody. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, beautiful.
Was it helpful to have the chumash in front of you?
Yes, I had a chumash, so we're all good. Excellent.